Okay, today we get to learn about a little piece of history that is an interesting part of the space knowledge that we have. Back in the late 1950s and 1960s, there was kind of a competition between the Soviet Union at the time and the United States. And it was a race who could get out to space first, kind of a race between these scientists. So we start in, again, the 1950s, and the first people out to space were the Soviets. They got out there before we did. In 1957, the Soviet launch of the Sputnik 1 satellite was the first satellite out to space, and it triggered the space race, right? So they got it out there in 1957. And then the United States began rapidly working on its own program, sending its first satellite, the Explorer 1, into orbit just 1 year later in 1958. We were just right behind them. Okay, and then later the United States established a whole government agency to kind of lead this space program, and they called it the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. I'm sure you've heard of that. So that was in 1957, 1958. Then 3 years later, in 1961, the Soviets sent the first human into space, right? So they just beat us out there. His name was Yuri, and he went in the Vostok 1. And then 1 month later, okay, just 1 month later, the first American was sent into space. His name was Alan Shepard, and he went aboard the Freedom 7 out to space. Okay, so you can see how this was just quite the race, back and forth between the Soviets and the United States. In 1962, a year later, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth 3 times. He went around in the Friendship 7. Okay, so now in 1961, you can see we're reading right here. President John F. Kennedy, he was the president at the time, he announced the Apollo program, which was an American effort to place a man on the moon by the end of the decade. All right, so it was 1961. He wanted, by 1969, he created the Apollo program and wanted to put a man on the moon. Well, on July 16th of 1969, right halfway through the last year, they did it. The United States sent astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon aboard the Apollo 11. 4 days into their journey, Collins separated the spacecraft into 2 parts. So the Apollo 11 separated into 2 parts. Collins stayed in the Columbia part, which was the command module, which continued to orbit around the moon. It went all the way around the moon, never landed. But Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were in the lunar module called the Eagle, which landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Right? The Eagle has landed. I'm sure you've heard that saying before. How long did it take them to get to the moon? Let's scroll down here at this picture. It took about 4 days. I'll keep this little because I can't quite. About 4 days and about 240,000 miles it took to get to the moon. The Eagle landed on a flat area of the moon's surface called the Sea of Tranquility. All right, 6.5 hours later, after it landed, Aldrin opened the hatch and Armstrong slowly backed out of the lunar module. This is such a poignant part of history, something that you'll see lots of clips of. Neil Armstrong slowly backed out of the lunar module, and in his excitement, what he stated is this. He said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." What do you think that means? It's just one small step that he took onto the moon, right, physically, but it's a big leap for mankind in our knowledge of space and our knowledge of the moon. All of their research and planning and all these scientists' work for years and decades had come to fruition here, and Neil Armstrong stepped foot onto the moon. Okay, if you look down here at this other little picture on the bottom, you can see, that's not going too well, is it? You can see the flag down there on the moon. And because there's no wind on the moon, but they wanted the flag to actually be visible and look like it was flying, so they ran a pole across the top of it. All right, so it looks like it's flying. And an interesting fact is they placed the moon on the side of the moon that's always facing the Earth, so that it's always from the Earth. You would, if you could look all the way up to the moon, you would see the moon flying there facing the Earth. Okay, so let's move on to the next page here. It says the Apollo 11's astronauts learned much about the moon during their 2.5-hour tour of it. They were only on the moon for 2.5 hours. However, certain things about the moon, like its bright and dark spots, are visible even without a telescope. You can look up and see, the bright and the dark spots. The moon's surface includes interesting features. A light-colored high peak on the moon is a mountain, and they call them a highland, right? Highlands. And a dark flat area would be is a sea, and it's called a mare, which is the Latin word for sea. Lunar seas are not filled with water, however. There's no water on the moon, no liquid water, but they're filled with hardened lava. A crater is a large, round depression that has been created by the impact of a meteoroid or a rock fragment from an asteroid or a comet. Craters exist on the Maria and even more so on the highlands. The moon's characteristics, which cannot sustain life, right? That life cannot be sustained on the moon, and because the moon's characteristics are quite different than those of the Earth. The moon has no atmosphere, no wind, no liquid water, and its temperatures vary extremely. When direct sunlight is hitting the moon's surface, right? So when it's getting the most heat and the most light from the sun, the temperatures can be up to 260 degrees. Okay, 260 degrees Fahrenheit, definitely not sustainable for life. And then without the sunlit temperatures, when the moon is facing away from the sun, it can get down to 400 degrees below zero, negative 400. So you can see why it cannot sustain life. Okay, we've got a picture down here, just a thin sample of rock from the moon that was brought back to the Earth by the Apollo 12 mission after the 11 mission. Different minerals and their textures are shown in this color photograph, which was taken through a microscope, right, with a special light. That's not what you can see with the human eye, but with a special microscope, look at all the different colors of that rock. Very interesting stuff, and hopefully you learned a little bit about the space race and Neil Armstrong and the 1969 landing on the moon.